Iran's Domestic Crisis and Implications for Armenia. Article by Sosi Tatikyan. Published on January 13, 2026, on EVN Report. Nationwide unrest in Iran, driven by economic collapse and deepening political discontent, has intensified amid an increasingly coercive state response and rising external tensions. In recent days, the scale and severity of repression have escalated, with growing reports of fatalities, mass arrests, and nationwide communication blackouts. As the crisis deepens, Iran's internal unrest is increasingly intersecting with regional security dynamics, raising the risk of external escalation and spillover beyond Iran's borders. For Armenia, these developments unfold against a recalibrated deterrence framework shaped by recent U.S.-brokered initiatives. Scope and nature of the protests. Iran is experiencing sustained nationwide protests that began in late December 2025 amid a sharp economic downturn. Currency depreciation, high inflation, and acute cost of living pressures fueled widespread unrest. What initially emerged as protests over economic hardship has evolved into broader political mobilization, with explicit criticism of the clerical leadership and anti-regime slogans spreading across Tehran, Isfahan, and multiple provincial centers. While economic grievances remain the primary driver, marked by eroding purchasing power, persistent unemployment, and the collapse of the national currency, political demands have become increasingly explicit and visible in the streets. Women have emerged as a particularly prominent and mobilizing force within the protests, giving the unrest a distinct political and symbolic character. Beyond economic hardship, demonstrations increasingly reflect deep frustration with systemic gender discrimination, legal restrictions, and pervasive social controls imposed on women. Women's visible participation, as organizers, symbols, and frontline protesters, has transformed the protests from a reaction to economic distress into a direct challenge to state authority and the ideological foundations of the Islamic Republic. This gender-driven mobilization has also contributed to the severity of the state response, as the authorities appear to view it not merely as dissent, but as a fundamental challenge to the regime's legitimacy, reinforcing reliance on repression rather than accommodation. Iran's multi-ethnic composition adds an additional layer of risk in periods of acute internal crisis, but it does not currently point toward imminent territorial disintegration. Iran is home to sizable minority populations, including Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, Baluchis, and others. Historically, episodes of nationwide unrest have raised concerns that their grievances could take on a separatist dimension. At present, however, there is no clear evidence that the current protest wave is being driven primarily by ethnic mobilization or organized secessionist agendas. The protests remain largely cross-ethnic and nationally framed, centered on governance failures, economic hardship, and state repression rather than territorial claims. That said, if repression intensifies further, or if central authority weakens asymmetrically across regions, localized unrest in peripheral areas could acquire a stronger ethnic dimension, increasing risks of fragmentation over time. In the short term, the probability of state disintegration remains low. In the medium term, sustained instability combined with coercive repression could heighten centrifugal pressures, particularly in border regions. Security response and state posture. Iranian security forces have responded forcefully to demonstrations, using crowd control measures and, in multiple instances, live fire. As of January 12, the U.S.-based human rights activists' news agency reports at least 646 fatalities since protests began in late December, including 505 protesters, 133 members of the security forces, 1 prosecutor, and 7 non-protesting civilians, with many more injured across multiple locations. The same sources report at least 10,600 detentions, though verified figures vary due to information restrictions. Credible reporting also indicates that Iranian authorities have carried out executions linked to protest-related charges, including allegations of espionage and enmity against God. International media and human rights organizations report that morgues in and around major urban centers, including Tehran, are operating beyond capacity, with bodies stored for extended periods due to the volume of casualties. At least 150 ambulances have reportedly been damaged, significantly impairing emergency medical response. independent verification remains difficult because of extensive nationwide information blackouts. Senior judicial authorities have warned of no leniency toward protesters, signaling readiness for sustained repression through harsh charges, prolonged detention, and punitive sentencing. In parallel, authorities have imposed extensive internet shutdowns and communication restrictions, severely limiting internal coordination and external visibility. The scale and geographic spread of the use of lethal force suggests that authorities have moved beyond episodic containment toward systematic suppression. Mass arrests have accelerated, targeting protesters, activists, and suspected organizers across both major urban centers and provincial towns, indicating an effort to preemptively dismantle protest networks rather than merely disperse demonstrations. At the same time, some statements from the executive branch have acknowledged state fault and promised remedies, pointing to a dual-track approach that combines repression with limited political signaling. Iranian leaders, including Ali Larijani and President Masoud Pezeshkian, have in recent days noted that peaceful protests over Iran's dire economy were legitimate and understandable. However, the sequencing and intensity of coercive measures indicate that repression, not de-escalation, has become the central pillar of the state's current strategy. Regime rhetoric, externalization of threats, and opposition. Official rhetoric has consistently framed the unrest as foreign-enabled and linked to internal subversion. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and other senior Iranian officials have publicly accused protesters of acting on behalf of foreign powers and of pursuing destabilizing agendas, describing them as mercenaries for foreigners or instruments of external enemies. These comments sharply tied the demonstrations to external interference, dismissing domestic grievances as a front for hostile influence. Senior military and security figures have warned that escalating hostile rhetoric from abroad constitutes a threat to national security and could prompt a stronger defensive posture, framing threats from the United States, Israel, and other external actors as justification for heightened security responses. Within this securitized narrative, authorities have also pursued high-profile actions, including arrests, prosecutions, and one reported execution under charges of espionage or collusion with foreign forces presented as necessary to counter external threats and reinforce deterrence. Iranian security messaging broadly equates foreign-backed actions with national betrayal and has invoked national security legislation in detention practices. At the same time, Reza Pahlavi, the eldest son of the last Shah of Iran and the most visible Iranian opposition figure in exile, has increased his public political messaging, explicitly calling for mobilization and portraying the current moment as an opening for democratic transition. His emphasis on transition planning and outreach to regime insiders, including defection channels and continuity mechanisms, has elevated regime transition narratives in international policy debates. However, his claim to serve as a credible or unifying leader of a democratic transition remains contested, given his long absence from Iran, limited organizational presence on the ground, and the absence of demonstrable internal consensus around his leadership. At the same time, no alternative opposition figure or structured movement has clearly emerged with comparable international visibility or coordination capacity, underscoring the fragmented and leaderless nature of Iran's opposition landscape. In this context, the growing prominence of externally articulated transition narratives, regardless of their internal legitimacy, risks intensifying anxiety among the regime and provoking an even harsher security response. This dynamic may heighten volatility and repression, even in the absence of a viable or imminent transition pathway. U.S. intervention warning and Iran's response. Tensions escalated sharply following a series of public warnings by President Donald Trump, who has issued intervention warnings over recent weeks, explicitly linking potential U.S. action to the Iranian authorities' use of lethal force against protesters. In his most direct formulation, Trump warned that the United States would come to the protesters' rescue if Iranian security forces were to shoot and violently kill peaceful protesters, framing the issue not only as a human rights concern, but as a potential trigger for U.S. action. Iranian officials responded sharply, with senior political and military figures stating that President Trump's remarks were unacceptable and publicly characterizing them as crossing a red line for Tehran. Tehran declared Israel, U.S. military and shipping centers as legitimate targets if Washington attacks, and placed its armed forces on heightened alert. It also brought the issue to the United Nations, calling for an international response to what it characterized as unlawful external threats against Iranian sovereignty. This exchange has significantly hardened the external dimension of the crisis, particularly as reports of casualties and repression have intensified. The escalation in rhetoric was evident at the December 29, 2025, meeting between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at Mar-a-Lago, where Iran featured prominently in discussions alongside Gaza and broader regional security issues. Following the meeting, both leaders publicly reaffirmed their shared focus on preventing Iran from advancing its nuclear and missile capabilities. Netanyahu reiterated Israel's readiness to act against perceived existential threats, while Trump warned that if Iran were rebuilding nuclear or missile sites, we're going to have to knock them down. Taken together, these statements amount to a conditional threat framework that explicitly links Iran's internal repression to the possibility of external escalation involving the U.S. and its regional partners. Given the sharp rise in casualties, mass arrests, and the use of live ammunition, this linkage now carries greater operational weight than in earlier phases of the crisis. The result has been a tightening cycle of signaling between Tehran, Washington, and Israel, sharpening perceptions of risk and increasing the potential for miscalculation, even in the absence of preparations for immediate, large-scale military intervention. The U.S. has long maintained a substantial standing force posture across the broader Middle East, including naval assets linked to the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and air assets at key regional bases, designed to deter Iran and protect U.S. personnel and partners. In the current escalatory environment, this existing posture allows Washington to raise readiness and project force without announcing a new crisis-specific buildup tied to Iran's internal unrest. In parallel, reporting indicates that the U.S. military has repositioned some aircraft and naval vessels away from bases assessed as vulnerable to Iranian attack, framed by U.S. officials as force protection and contingency measures rather than preparations for imminent hostilities. On January 12, President Trump stated that Iranian representatives had reached out to Washington to initiate negotiations and that a date for talks had been set. He simultaneously warned, however, that the United States might still take action before those talks occur, signaling that diplomacy and coercion are being pursued in parallel rather than as sequential alternatives. In a further indication of heightened risk, the U.S. State Department has urged American citizens in Iran to leave the country immediately, directing them to depart via Armenia or Turkey. These adjustments can therefore be read in two, not mutually exclusive ways, as prudent steps to reduce exposure during heightened tension, and as quiet deterrence signaling that reinforces the credibility of U.S. escalation capacity amid President Trump's repeated conditional warnings to Tehran. Not formally declaring a deployment does not reduce the risk of escalation. Instead, it preserves strategic ambiguity by signaling readiness without committing to military action. The 2025 U.S. National Security Strategy and the Threshold for Intervention. The 2025 U.S. National Security Strategy places strong emphasis on protecting core and vital interests through military, economic, and diplomatic tools. It takes a selective approach to commitments and underscores that the U.S. does not pursue military intervention as an instrument of regime change, democracy promotion, or nation building, but rather as a tool to defend defined strategic interests and manage risks to U.S. security. Within this framework, a full-scale military intervention in Iran based solely in response to protest suppression falls outside the threshold the NSS envisions for the use of force. However, the convergence of internal repression, nuclear and missile concerns, and explicit U.S. deterrence signaling reduces the clarity of these thresholds in practice. By contrast, limited deterrence measures, including coercive diplomacy, targeted military or cyber operations, and indirect pressure, align more closely with the strategy's objective of containing instability before it threatens U.S. regional interests, strategic assets, or allies. Direct U.S. military intervention in the near term may depend on a secondary trigger, such as credible threats to U.S. forces, major attacks on U.S. assets, or dramatic escalation involving Iran's nuclear or missile programs, Yet the intensification of repression and Iran's increasingly confrontational external rhetoric increase the probability of limited military action. The risk of escalation by Israel. Large-scale Israeli intervention in Iran in response to protests alone remains unlikely in the near term. Israel views Iran's nuclear program and regional military posture as strategic threats, but its current approach relies on deterrence and selective actions. The more immediate risk lies in targeted or covert operations linked to nuclear, missile, or regional escalation dynamics, particularly as Iran issues preemptive warnings against Israel. Overall, the likelihood of limited or episodic U.S. or Israeli military action has increased, even if large-scale intervention remains uncertain. Tactical, symbolic, or deterrence-driven actions tied to strategic thresholds cannot be ruled out and constitute a real regional risk. Armenia's deterrence shift from Iran to a U.S.-brokered process. During the 2025 Iran-Israel confrontation, Armenia faced heightened risk. Azerbaijan could have exploited Tehran's preoccupation with the Israel-Iran confrontation to launch a military offensive against Armenia, framing such action as aligned with or supportive of Israel's security interests, while advancing its long-standing objective of establishing a transit corridor through Armenian territory, potentially severing Armenia's southern border with Iran. During that period, U.S. State Secretary Marco Rubio publicly noted a real risk of an Azerbaijani invasion of Armenia. The August 8, 2025 Washington Declaration and U.S.-led trip framework shifted Armenia's deterrence logic. The Armenia-Azerbaijan peace agreement remains unfinished and unsigned, but the U.S.-brokered process itself now acts as a key deterrent. The political, diplomatic, and reputational costs of disrupting it have grown more significant. U.S. involvement as broker has significantly altered Azerbaijani escalation calculations toward Armenia. At the meeting with Netanyahu, Trump also claimed credit for having settled the dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan, asserting that progress had been achieved rapidly and under U.S. pressure, including the threat of 200% trade tariffs. For many in Armenia, this coercive leverage is understood as having been directed at Baku rather than Yerevan, given that Azerbaijan, not Armenia, has been the principal party obstructing the conclusion and implementation of the peace process. This framing places the Armenia-Azerbaijan track firmly within a U.S.-managed diplomatic process and links its continuation to American political ownership. In the current regional context, marked by the Israel-Iran confrontation, this U.S. positioning significantly narrows Azerbaijan's room to justify a military offensive against Armenia, including narratives that could frame escalation as indirectly serving Israeli security interests. By tying de-escalation on the Armenian front to U.S. mediation and credibility, Washington has raised the political and economic costs for any Azerbaijani attempt to exploit regional war dynamics, whether through claims of supporting Israel, countering Iran, or advancing corridor-related objectives by force. Armenia-Iran relations. Despite significant differences in governance systems and religious frameworks, Armenia and Iran maintain a multifaceted and strategically significant relationship shaped primarily by geopolitics and practical economic ties, including trade, transport connectivity, and infrastructure cooperation. Iran has played an important deterrent role in Armenia's immediate security environment. Tehran has consistently opposed any attempts to alter regional borders or impose extraterritorial connectivity arrangements, positioning itself as a critical constraint on Azerbaijan's long-standing push for a so-called Zangezur corridor through Armenia's southern Shunak region. Iran's repeated political signaling and clear articulation of red lines regarding connectivity and sovereignty have contributed to raising the costs of Azerbaijan's coercive scenarios against Armenia. For Armenia, engagement with Iran has been a key element of strategic diversification and strengthening sovereignty, particularly in the context of competing regional connectivity projects and shifting external mediation frameworks. At the same time, the relationship has required careful diplomatic calibration, given Armenia's parallel efforts to expand cooperation with Western partners and navigate an increasingly complex regional balance. Tehran initially viewed the U.S.-brokered trip framework with caution. expressing concern that new connectivity arrangements could alter regional balances or affect Iran's strategic access routes, even as it publicly emphasized respect for Armenia's sovereignty. Shortly after the August 2025 Washington summit, Iran's president visited Armenia, and Yerevan and Tehran announced their intention to formalize a strategic partnership agreement, signaling a shared interest in institutionalizing bilateral ties amid regional uncertainty while managing sensitivities linked to evolving U.S.-led initiatives. In early January 2026, Armenia and Iran held political consultations in Yerevan, co-chaired by Armenia's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vahan Kostanyan, and Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister for Political Affairs, Majid Takht Ravanchi. They reaffirmed their commitment to advancing bilateral relations toward a strategic partnership and discussed cooperation in areas including energy, infrastructure, trade, and regional connectivity, as well as developments in the regional and international security environment. Over the past several days, Iranian protesters have gathered in front of the Iranian embassy in Yerevan to demonstrate against the repression of protests inside Iran and to express solidarity with demonstrators affected by violence and internet shutdowns. Beyond diplomacy and geopolitics, Armenia's position is shaped by acute domestic sensitivities. As a country formally committed to democracy, governed by a ruling party that emerged from the 2018 Velvet Revolution, and marked by the collective memory of March 1, 2008, when security forces and the army suppressed post-election protests, killing 10 people, events in Iran resonate in Armenia not only strategically but also normatively. This sensitivity is reinforced by expressions of solidarity with Iranian protesters within Armenia's liberal civil society. At the same time, segments of Armenia's illiberal opposition have begun echoing Russian narratives that frame the unrest as a U.S.-armed and Israel-driven effort at regime change. At the same time, Trump announced on January 12 that any country doing business with Iran would face a 25% tariff on trade with the U.S., effective immediately, as part of heightened economic pressure in response to Tehran's handling of the nationwide unrest. The move is expected to affect major trading partners of Iran, including China, the United Arab Emirates, India, and other nations with significant commercial ties to Tehran, although details on implementation and legal authority remain unclear. While Armenia is not a direct target of such measures, the escalation of U.S. secondary economic pressure carries clear implications for Yerevan, which maintains trade and connectivity with Iran. Heightened enforcement risks increasing indirect economic exposure and further narrowing Armenia's already constrained space to balance strategic necessity with compliance pressures from Western partners. Against this backdrop, Armenia faces limited room for maneuver. While sustaining engagement with Iran remains a strategic geopolitical necessity and regional balance, Yerevan is also structurally constrained in opposing the United States at a moment of deepening bilateral cooperation and reliance on U.S.-brokered diplomatic processes and the TRIP initiative. The timing of Armenia's contacts with Tehran amid Iran's internal unrest and heightened U.S.-Iran tensions therefore underscores the growing need for careful diplomatic calibration to avoid perceptions of political alignment as regional polarization intensifies. Armenia-Israel relations. Armenia's relations with Israel have been strained due in large part to Tel Aviv's strategic military partnership with Azerbaijan, which supplied significant quantities of advanced drones, weapons and munitions used by Baku in the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War and in subsequent operations against Armenia. Israel's strategic relationship with Azerbaijan has been central to its regional posture, including energy cooperation and its balancing against Iran. In parallel, the Armenian genocide has not only remained unrecognized by Israel, but has been instrumentalized in Israel-Turkey relations, including through recent statements and positioning by Prime Minister Netanyahu and earlier Israeli officials, reinforcing Armenian perceptions that the genocide issue is treated as a geopolitical bargaining tool with Turkey rather than a historical and moral question. Armenia's recognition of the State of Palestine has added an additional layer of sensitivity in bilateral relations. Taken together, these dynamics have limited the depth and trust underpinning bilateral engagement. Despite this history of tension, recent contacts suggest a cautious effort by Armenia to explore pragmatic engagement with Israel. These have included a recent visit by Armenia's Deputy Foreign Minister to Israel, accompanied by dialogue aimed at assessing avenues for expanded cooperation. This engagement does not signal a strategic realignment, but rather reflects Yerevan's attempt to manage a complex relationship shaped by mistrust, rooted primarily in Israel's alliance with Azerbaijan, while preserving flexibility in an increasingly fluid regional environment. Regime change scenarios in Iran and Armenia's strategic exposure. Regime change in Iran has become a more explicit subject of international discussion. For Armenia, the central issue is not only whether political change occurs, but how, through a managed transition that preserves institutional continuity, or through a destabilizing rupture that reshapes Iran's internal and regional posture. A managed transition toward a more open and accountable political order, involving limited but genuine political liberalization, greater institutional transparency, and some expansion of political participation without abrupt collapse of state authority, could prove broadly beneficial for Armenia. Such an outcome would likely preserve core state institutions and border policy, while reducing Iran's isolation, improving economic connectivity, and enhancing predictability in trade relations. In this scenario, the Armenia-Iran border would remain strategically vital for Armenia's diversification efforts, while Yerevan would avoid an acute dilemma in balancing relations between Iran and Western partners. By contrast, a destabilizing transition marked by elite rupture or security fragmentation would represent the most disruptive outcome for Armenia. This scenario could generate border security uncertainty, disrupt trade and energy flows, intensify external competition over northern Iran's strategic geography, and weaken one of the region's traditional constraints against coercive connectivity narratives. For Armenia, the erosion of Iran's stabilizing role would translate into heightened vulnerability at a moment of already significant regional flux. A third scenario, hardline consolidation following repression, would not resolve Iran's structural crisis, but could produce a more securitized and inward-looking posture. Under such conditions, Tehran may become increasingly suspicious of neighbors' Western engagements and external diplomatic initiatives. Armenia would then face a narrower operating space in balancing strategic partnerships with Iran, the United States, the European Union, and other regional actors, particularly if Iran begins to interpret Western diplomacy in the South Caucasus, including the American TRIP initiative and EU activities through a hostile or zero-sum lens. Beyond these trajectories, a low-probability but high-impact worst-case scenario warrants consideration. Sustained repression, rising casualties, prolonged information blackouts, and elite fragmentation could erode central authority to the point of state fragmentation. Given Iran's multi-ethnic composition, such a breakdown would risk activating ethnic and regional fault lines, particularly in peripheral areas. For Armenia, this is especially sensitive in Iran's north, home to a large Azeri population, where separatist or irredentist dynamics could carry direct spillover risks for the South Caucasus. In this scenario, unrest would likely shift from a nationally framed crisis to one with ethnic and territorial dimensions, creating openings for external interference akin to the fragmentation dynamics seen in Syria and Iraq. At present, there is no conclusive evidence that Iran is on the brink of such fragmentation, and the protests remain largely cross-ethnic and nationally framed. However, if repression intensifies further, casualties continue to rise, and political pathways remain closed, the risk of centrifugal dynamics, including ethnic mobilization, localized armed resistance, or external exploitation, would increase over time. For Armenia, this would constitute the most destabilizing scenario. It would weaken one of the region's key constraints on coercive connectivity narratives, amplify border insecurity, disrupt trade and energy flows, and further complicate an already fragile regional balance. The Armenian community in Iran. Iran's Armenian community is one of the Middle East's most historically rooted. It is concentrated primarily in Tehran and Isfahan, New Julfa, with recognized religious minority status and dedicated parliamentary representation. Armenian official diaspora sources estimate the community at 60,000 to 80,000. If unrest continues, the Armenian community in Iran may face increased insecurity, disruptions to schools and religious institutions, and restrictions on movement. This could drive emigration, including a flow of Iranian Armenians toward Armenia in the event of further escalation, particularly among families with existing ties there. Armenia will face a diplomatic challenge. preparing to receive potential arrivals while advocating for the safety and rights of ethnic Armenians in Iran, without appearing to support external interference or regime change. Border spillover risks and potential displacement. While direct spillover of violence from Iran into Armenia is not the most likely scenario, prolonged instability or escalation increases the risk of indirect border effects. These include increased securitization of the Armenia-Iran border, stricter movement controls, and less predictable cross-border trade and transit. Even without physical spillover, stronger internal security measures in Iran could disrupt logistics, delay commerce, and raise costs along Armenia's only southern outlet. In more adverse scenarios, particularly if unrest reaches Iran's northwestern regions or causes elite fragmentation, border management could become more restrictive. While large-scale refugee flows from Iran into Armenia remain unlikely, escalation increases the likelihood of selective population movement. This would most plausibly include both Iranian Armenians, whose social, linguistic, and institutional ties make Armenia a natural destination, and smaller numbers of non-Armenian Iranian nationals seeking temporary safety or onward transit. Such movement would likely be limited, uneven, and driven by proximity, individual networks, and border accessibility, rather than mass displacement dynamics. Conclusion: Iran has entered a phase of internal crisis, marked by lethal repression, mass arrests, and expanding information blackouts. While the unrest has not yet produced a regime-ending rupture, it has exposed profound structural vulnerabilities and intensified anxiety across the political and security establishment. The prevailing trajectory points toward stabilization through force rather than reform, a course that heightens both domestic volatility and the risk of externalized crisis behavior. Against this backdrop, limited military intervention by the U.S. or Israel cannot be excluded, particularly in connection with nuclear, missile, or broader regional security concerns. For Armenia, Iran's internal crisis unfolds within a fundamentally transformed deterrence environment. Whereas Iran previously functioned as an informal constraint against coercive changes to Armenia's borders, deterrence has increasingly shifted toward the political, diplomatic, and economic costs Azerbaijan would face by undermining a U.S.-brokered peace process in the South Caucasus. At the same time, escalating instability in Iran complicates Armenia's already delicate task of balancing strategic relations with Iran, the United States, the EU, and other regional actors. This instability increases Armenia's exposure to indirect spillover effects, including border securitization, trade disruption, and the potential inflow of Iranian Armenians and other refugees in the event of major escalation. Armenia's vulnerability is therefore cumulative rather than immediate, underscoring the need for calibrated diplomacy, contingency planning, and sustained monitoring in an increasingly unstable regional environment.